The Supreme Court just ruled that birthright citizenship survived 6-3. That's the headline everyone is talking about. But the more interesting story is the dissent almost nobody is actually reading. Nearly 100 pages from Justice Clarence Thomas trying to rebuild the whole legal argument from scratch. So let's talk about what he actually said. Back in January of 2025, President Trump signed an executive order saying kids born in the U.S. to undocumented parents or the parents just visiting temporarily don't automatically get citizenship. His argument was that the Constitution never meant for them to count. Families sued, lower courts blocked the order, and it made its way up to the Supreme Court. On June 30th, the court ruled 6-3 against Trump, with Chief Justice Roberts writing the majority and Justices Barrett and Kavanaugh siding against the administration. Clarence Thomas dissented, and Justice Gorsuch joined him. And that dissent is what I want to dig into. Here's Thomas' big idea. He says the Constitution was never really about where you were born. It was about where you were domiciled, meaning your permanent legal home. So under his reading, born here is not enough on its own. You also had to actually belong here in a legal sense for your kids to automatically become citizens. Now, to make that case, Thomas goes all the way back to Dred Scott. He argues the 14th Amendment was written to undo that ruling, but only for people who were, in his words, domiciled here. Freed slaves counted, he says, because they had nowhere else to go and no other homeland, and that is the crux of the whole fight. He is using the amendment that overturned Dred Scott to justify a more narrow reading of who counts as a citizen today. From my perspective, that is exactly the kind of move that should make people skeptical, because it takes a constitutional promise meant to expand equality and tries to shrink it again. Thomas also raises a quieter argument that is easy to miss. He says the lower court should not have blocked this order for everyone at once. In other words, he thinks the challenge was too broad and that courts should not be handing out nationwide relief so easily. That part is not really about citizenship. It is about how much power courts have to block a policy nationwide. One more thing worth knowing. Thomas does not say every child of an undocumented parent automatically loses citizenship. His test is domicile, not just paperwork. And Gorsuch, in his own dissent, goes even further by suggesting some children of long-term residents might still qualify even under the more narrow theory. Near the end, Thomas accuses the majority of repurposing the 14th Amendment to cover the children of birth tourists and undocumented immigrants. That is the most charged line in the opinion, and it is doing real rhetorical work by lumping very different situations together. Now, to be fair, Thomas is not making this up out of thin air. The idea of domicile does have real roots in 19th century law, and the historical record does include references that he can point to. So there is a real legal tradition here, not just talking points. And I want to be clear about something else. I do believe there is a difference between someone who is truly part of life in this country and someone who is only here briefly, specifically to give birth. In that narrow case, I can understand why people question automatic citizenship. That is a real debate, and it should be taken seriously. But I still think the majority has the stronger case. For more than 100 years, courts and the government itself read subject to the jurisdiction of to cover almost everyone born here except children of diplomats and invading armies. That is the rule the court says was settled back in 1898. Thomas is asking one word, domicile, to do a lot of work when it barely shows up in the record he is citing. And that is why this dissent matters. It is not just a technical disagreement. It is an attempt to narrow a basic idea of belonging. So my view is simple. Birthright citizenship should stay broad, clear, and equal. If you are born in the United States, you are an American. That is the cleanest, fairest, and most democratic reading of the Constitution. Peace.